Smile, everyone. You're on camera. Thanks, Trish, as always. And hi, everybody. I'm just going to say hi, Kathy. Hi, Glenn. Hi, Laura. Hi, Nina, of course. Hi, Janet, Joanne, Leslie, Joyce, Julian, Jaime, Jennifer, Vicky, and mis amigos, Fran and Jorge in España. Great to see you guys, of course. Thanks, everybody, for being here and tuning in for this last episode of the Habsburgs book month. It was, I can just tell you, super, super fun for me to get to geek out on this topic, about which I am very slightly geeky, as you can probably tell. And I'm really, really interested to hear your thoughts, to discuss whatever you want to discuss. In particular, though, to discuss some of the questions that I kind of threw out there on that spreadsheet, just to see if that, is interesting for anybody. I don't have a presentation per se this time. I was just going to offer a few little thoughts at the very beginning because I really want to kind of do some discussion and have a conversation and see maybe if you guys have things that are particularly interesting to you about the family, about the book, about anything that I presented earlier in the month. But what I was going to just launch us with was actually thinking about the Habsburgs as a traveler. Because, of course, there's all the kind of deep history that's in the book and, some of the other things that I presented over the month. But thinking about them the way that most of us might encounter them, unless you live in one of the countries where they ruled, where you potentially encounter some of their legacies on a more regular basis. But especially if you, say, come over from North America to whether it's, Spain, Portugal, or Austria, Czech lands, whatever, how are you going to interact with the Habsburgs? And thinking it's just like the traveler, what's that experience like in relation to the Habsburg dynasty? And the way I think about it is that the Habsburgs weren't just a family. They were actually, in a way, a civilization. And what I mean by that is that they created this distinctive, recognizable, boundaried cultural realm. And what's interesting is that even though the political boundaries have changed a lot in some cases by now, I mean, different countries, have broken off and bits of countries have broken off. And there's, the political borders today don't look exactly like, of course, that they did even in 1918, right? But the cultural boundaries have changed much less in many ways. Just as an example, you can go all the way from far Western Austria. So there's the bit of Austria that's right up against Switzerland. You can go from there all the way east to what's today Ukraine or Romania and still recognize it. Like there is something similar, both in the look of places, but also the feel of places, like the centers of towns, of the historic towns, whether you're in far Western Austria or you're in Transylvania, the centers of towns have major similarities. And this applies above all to the Danubian domains, so the kind of Central Europe bits of the Habsburg realms, because when you get to Spain or Portugal or Italy or Belgium, those places are diverse enough and have had kind of different enough trajectories that they aren't quite as much a part of a consistent civilization as the Central European realms and countries, societies are. But in those Danubian domains, a remarkably consistent culture radiated out from Vienna, and you can still see it today. So, for example, I talked in the previous presentation, so last week, about plague columns, right? If you are standing on a main town square in some, larger town anywhere in Central Europe, you're probably going to see a plague column. It's probably going to be Baroque. There's probably going to be the Virgin Mary or the Trinity sitting right on top of it. And that's one of the ways, oh yeah, I am probably in Habsburg Central Europe right now because there's the main town square and there's a plague column, right? Or another example, these pastel Baroque churches with those beautiful little onion domes. You see them just all over Central Europe, and that's just the stamp of the Habsburgs. But another example I think of is especially with urbanization in the 19th century, as cities throughout Europe, many of them grew very quickly in the last few decades of the 19th century. And in Central Europe, you have these blocks of houses, or I mean, it's really, they're flats, they're apartments, these big blocks. And you could plop yourself on an unnamed street corner and not know for sure whether you're in Vienna, Prague, Budapest, Zagreb, etc. Because these cities developed in a very similar way at right around 1900 in all the former Habsburg lands. And a fantastic example of this is Sarajevo, today the capital of Bosnia, right? Which the Habsburgs didn't actually even rule that long, really just from 1878. But there is a line in Sarajevo, and if you've never been to Sarajevo, you've got to go to someday because it's such a fascinating city. There's a line in Sarajevo on kind of the main pedestrian drag where the old Ottoman Turkish city stops and the Habsburg city begins, where you move from something that looks kind of like Turkey to something that looks kind of like Austria. And it's pretty amazing. And even on this actual line, you go to Sarajevo and there's a marking in the pavement that says you can step from east to west right here, because it was where east met west. But just that example of the Habsburgs came in, had this blueprint, created this modern city in Sarajevo, and it's such a contrast to what was there before, but suddenly Sarajevo started to look like Vienna. And then one last example that I was going to mention of the like cities is these incredibly ornate theaters, also from the period of rapid urbanization in the later 1800s. And literally, you can go from provincial town in Austria to provincial town in Romania to provincial town in Ukraine, and there's these opulent theaters there, and they all kind of look alike, in part because they were actually almost all of them designed by the same architectural firm. Helmut und Fellner was the name of this architectural firm that designed these theaters for cities all over the former Habsburg realms in Central Europe. And that's another way that if you walk up on some square, you say you closed your eyes, you opened them, and you see this opulent opera house. It's like, wait a second, that looks almost exactly like the opera house I saw in Prague. Well, then you must be, let's say, in Eastern Hungary suddenly, or in Rijeka on the Adriatic in Zagreb, because those similarities are there, like those veins, that cultural boundaries that are there. And that's the stuff you can see in the physical geography of these places, but there's other cultural stuff and some social things, sometimes very deep and sometimes right on the surface. So the surface things that you'll find if you, as a traveler going around this region, is that Habsburg Central Europe is classic coffee and cake land, which is one of the things that I love about Central Europe. Not to say you can't get coffee and cake in other countries, right? Other cultures, but coffee and cake, you can't not have coffee and cake when you're in Central Europe. Like it's just too important, right? It might be a nice sidelight in, I don't know what, France or something, but coffee and cake is not a sidelight when you get to Central Europe. And more broadly, like the cuisines in the Danubian domains, they're distinct but related. And part of that goes back to the boundaries, the cultural boundaries surpass the political boundaries. Like the Viennese aristocracy might have a chef from Bohemia, or this other aristocratic family might have a chef from Hungary, and the influences get spread. And then the stuff you probably can't see so much, but is still there, like these deep imprints of this Habsburg culture, of this civilization. This is pretty nerdy, but it's there. And this is the quality of governance. So it's actually how these places are governed today. And there have been studies that compare the places, there's boundaries that cut through countries where the countries used to belong to two different empires. So Ukraine used to belong partly to the Romanovs and kind of the Russian Empire, and partly to the Habsburg Empire. Serbia, for example, used to belong partly to the Habsburg Empire and partly to the Ottoman Empire. And so, but today there are these countries, right? And now you can look at certain indicators of the quality of government in these countries, and you find that the places that were ruled by the Habsburgs are better governed than the places that were ruled, ruined, that might be a Freudian slip, but governed by these other empires. So the thing is, the Habsburgs brought this more modern bureaucracy, this kind of Central and Western European quality of bureaucracy. And bureaucracy usually has like a bad name, bureaucrats, right? Bureaucracy is actually really important because bureaucrats help run things and make sure that, you know, you get the clean water in your pipes, or the electricity stays on, or, you know, today vaccinations get distributed appropriately. So bureaucracy and bureaucrats are important. And the Habsburgs created this bureaucracy all throughout their realm, which was actually quite good, right? And so the governance things, like even in former Yugoslavia, like Slovenia and Croatia, were Habsburg lands for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they're still better governed today than if you go farther east and south in the Balkans, right? If you've been to these places, just kind of wrapping this up, if you've been to these places or you go to them, you'll of course hear the stories from the history, right? And I hope now, if you've read the book, or if you've attended some of these presentations, I hope now that maybe when you hear the name Maria Theresia, for example, or Franz Josef, that it means a little bit more. You're in Vienna, you hear Franz Josef, oh yeah, he was the next to last guy, the guy with the, you know, the old whiskers, he lived a really long time, you know, good old Franz Josef, Kaiser Franz Josef. So I hope that gives you a bit more context, like this stuff means a little bit more. But also I hope that if you ever do a trip around the region, or if you come back, if you've already been, that you might notice how the cultural borders don't really map exactly onto the political borders. So that you will see, if you're observant, if you're thinking about it, you'll see how certain cultural things stay the same, say as you travel from Austria over to Slovakia, over to Hungary, and then maybe down to Hungary, or to Croatia, right? Like, you go into a church, let's say, and you see some totally over-the-top Baroque altarpiece, and you understand, aha, yeah, you know what? I know what this is about. This is because the Habsburgs and their recatholicization of their lands after the 30 Years' War and after reconquering the lands from the Ottoman Empire, and they wanted to emblazon these territories with the glory of the Catholic Church. They wanted to like stamp people's minds with their idea of the majesty of Catholicism, which reflected the majesty of the dynasty. So I hope some deep thoughts like that, those things might bubble up to the surface next time you're in this part of the world. But there's even the less deep. For example, I just had dinner and now I'm hungry for dessert, so I'm thinking of Palacinki, which is like crepes. In like English terms, we call them kind of crepes. And you can get Palacinki in Vienna, typical dessert. You can get Palacinki in Prague. You can get Palacinki in Krakow. They're not exactly the same, but they're similar. So even the dessert culture of this part of the world, yep, it kind of tells you they all used to be part of one empire, even if now they're these different countries. So that's something that totally fascinates me, is how you can see the civilization, you can feel the civilization still there, even though Habsburgs haven't been ruling these places now for a little over 100 years. Desserts, yeah, exactly. No, I mean, I'm wishing I had some cake, some strudel. Man, if only we could have, if I could send everybody some virtual strudel right now, what a great world that would be. But so those are some of my thoughts. Let me turn to one of the questions that Leslie kind of also hit upon, and I would love to hear all of your thoughts on this, right? This is the inbreeding question. Like, why do you think the Habsburgs did so much inbreeding, even though it was known at the time to be really problematic? And I would love if you would, just speak up, right? Just unmute yourself. Like, what did you get out of that? Like, why do you think that this family inbred so much? What was that about? Anybody have thoughts?
I mean, my first guess would just be conservation of power, right? I mean, you keep, you know your lineage, you know where it's going to stay. And even if you're trying to expand your empire by conquering new territories or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean that those alliances are going to be in your favor, or it's going to work out exactly as you plan, or somebody's not going to betray you for whatever reason. So if you can keep it in-house, you have a little bit more control.
Yeah, keep it in the family, right? Yeah, that totally makes sense. Other thoughts?
I think I would say that like now we know smoking is bad and we shouldn't smoke. I would say in those days, even though they knew that this was, as you say, problematic, it probably wasn't really thought in their heads to be as problematic, just like smoking is a danger. So I would think, again, as Trish said, they were after containing the power, and they didn't think that this was really as problematic as it was known to be. That would be my guess.
Yeah.
Didn't that time, but that would be my guess.
Yeah, that I think there's definitely something to that. Somebody else started to talk just before Glenn. Who's going to say what?
I would think there's tremendous separation from the aristocracy from the rest of society, to the extent that it would, despite the knowledge, the biological knowledge, the science, there's the overwhelming cultural heritage would, you're better off staying with your own people, so to speak, for lack of a better phrase, and which I think would descend all the way back to the ancient Egyptians. So.
Totally, yeah. There's an idea of a bloodline, which just it's mostly gone day to day. I think. I mean, aristocratic families that still like have some ideas, but I think most people just don't think of the bloodline stuff, which is hugely important. Any other thoughts on this? I mean, uncles married nieces and had children with their nieces, stuff which is, I mean, not okay, right?
Charles II.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that guy, he's the outcome of this kind of stuff, the dead end, right? Well, you guys have sussed it out, right? There's these ideas of the bloodline. It's partly that people didn't know that it was quite as bad, but you know what? They did have an inkling, right? Because like the Habsburgs had to get special dispensation from the Pope, because this consanguineal marriage, like people did know you shouldn't really be doing about it. You shouldn't really be doing that kind of thing. But let me pick up from, I don't know whether you pronounce it Jaime or Jamie, but what Jamie just said about like the bloodline kind of stuff. One of the other things you have to remember is that these aristocrats, these noble families, they don't want to marry down, right? They want to marry somebody from their own status. And so this is, I mean, the inbreeding kind of stuff happens, and it has happened in a lot of aristocratic families. Like the Habsburgs were not the only ones who did it. They kind of became the poster children for its negative effects, though. But other families did this because there's just this mentality that you don't want somebody from a lesser rank entering your family. But then what makes the Habsburgs, they take it to a next level, is because they think that nobody is at their level. No other family is as high as they are. So for them to marry, even though they did eventually start marrying other families, and at various points they did, but in that kind of in the 17th century and to a certain extent in the 18th century, they thought, yeah, the Rothschilds, yes. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely lots of families that keep it a little bit too close to home, I think. But the Habsburgs thought that, you know what, nobody else is as good as us, so we're just going to marry each other. Yeah, which is pretty crazy, but that was what they thought. And some of the other things were that you have to put into this mix was the political stuff. Like Trish was kind of touching on this, that there was a geopolitical rationale for having a Spanish Habsburg uncle marry his Austrian Habsburg niece. And that is to keep the dynasty's links close, to keep the alliance between the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs very close. That has its logic, right? Even though it is also pretty alarming when you get people like Carlos II, who is so disabled because of how inbred his DNA is. And then just one last thing. I don't know if it can make sense of the inbreeding for you, but it helps explain it. And this is a really, it's like distinctive to the historical period, that it used to be before the Reformation, the Habsburgs did marry more families from a kind of wider pool. then what happens with the Reformation is you get the split in Catholics and Protestants. And the Habsburgs, being extremely strong Catholics, are only going to marry other extremely strong Catholic families. So you've taken away dozens of potentially eligible aristocratic families with whom the Habsburgs used to make marriages, and the pool just gets that much smaller. Like the Habsburgs will not marry a Protestant until you get into the 1800s, where it starts. Even then, it's not really okay, but they then start to casting a bit farther afield. So all these things mean that you get uncles marrying nieces, and it's pretty crazy. It had its logic. It also had its, as we know, terrible results with madness and physical disability, mental disability, all this kind of stuff. So that's kind of the inbreeding thing. That's heavy stuff. I would love to know if anybody has an answer as to like which Habsburg you'd most want to have coffee with. Did anybody think about that one? And anybody want to share? Yeah, please, Jorge.
Okay. Only just out of curiosity, I would love to ask Philip II how would it feel to be the holding the crown of the first global empire. You know, having such a big, huge responsibility all over the world. Everybody knows, well, at least, you know, part of our job, that, you know, and Trish, this is also referring to you, the Philippine Islands was named after him because of Philippines, right? Although they were already Portuguese, part of them, but it was part of the Spanish Armada in those days. So I would love to have coffee with him saying, hey, how does it feel like? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, to like have the world at your feet in a certain way, right? Yeah, I mean, I would have coffee. I would want to have coffee with so many different Habsburgs. It's really hard for me to narrow down, but Philip II would be one of my top choices. Anybody else? Another of my top choices, I'd love to hear anybody else's, but I would be another Spanish Habsburg, and that's Philip IV. And I find him pretty fascinating because he was such a cultured guy, right? Like I talked about his friendship with him and Velázquez. And he tried pretty hard as a monarch. Like he tried to do right. He tried to rule well. He tried to do some important reforms in the Spanish Empire at the time, and he failed. And he's one of the ones that was the uncle who ended up marrying his niece and having Charles II because his previous heir to the throne died. Yeah, there he is. There's the man himself. Well done, Jorge. You are on it. Got that mustache, you know. And you know, I write in the book about one of Velázquez's late portraits of Philip IV, where Philip IV, he looks sad to me, right? Like he knows that his empire is kind of flaming out. His beloved son, his first son, his heir to the throne, died young. His hopes were dashed in so many ways. And I would love to get inside Philip IV's brain and say, like, man, how do you cope with having had so much and seeing it kind of slip through your fingers? Anybody else? Nobody else wants to take a Habsburg for coffee?
Well, no, I had a question, though, regarding the Spanish Habsburgs from a linguistic standpoint. Were those Habsburgs well-versed in speaking Castilian Spanish, or did that have an influence on those in Spain who were then having to learn Germanic expressions and do all of that? Yeah,
so Charles V, kind of the first Habsburg to rule Spain, he learned Spanish, and it later became, it was not his first language. Like he grew up speaking French mostly, but he spoke French, Spanish, German, Flemish, Dutch very well. So Spanish was, you know, like his fourth language. It became the one towards the end of his life that he preferred. But then the ones after him, the Spanish Habsburgs after him, mainly spoke Spanish. They had other people at court who were from Austria and who maybe didn't speak it as well. But yeah, Spanish was the main language of the dynasty by the time Philip II, Charles V's son, kind of came to power. So yeah.
Nina had a comment.
Please.
No, I'm just, now we're talking about the men. I was just,
Mm.
my usual comment.
Yeah. No, I mean, we
What
can
about the
totally.
women? No, I was thinking, obviously there's some, powerful women. We have Maria Theresia, etc., Sisi, etc.
Mm.
But there are the moments, and now I'm sorry because I can't remember all the names. You probably know them.
Okay. Yeah.
But there are these occasions back in the 1400s, 1500s, where it's, you write, I think it was the Netherlands, so
Mm.
one of the women, one of
Mm-hmm.
the queens maybe, was left actually with the administration. And I
Mm-hmm.
thought that would be an important and a interesting woman to have a coffee with.
Mm.
Because how do you do as a woman? I mean, I've studied that subject a bit, the medieval times and women, and particularly in France. But how do you get your ideas through? How do you I mean, you're essentially what? You're a mother, you're giving birth to children who die, and then
Mm.
you try again. And it is fascinating to me, how these women actually mentally survived, if I can say that, in having been, in a certain degree, you say they had power, right? To certain degree,
Mm-hmm.
certainly, obviously. But I can't remember which one of I think it was in the Netherlands somewhere.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, and there are a couple of the Habsburg women who became like the regents of the Netherlands. I think that, Nina, that's a fantastic answer and example, because they were several of those Habsburg women who ruled in the Netherlands. They were like really smart, really effective. It was unusual to have a woman with that much power who in theory could tell the men, including the high aristocrats, what to do. And how did they make that work? That stuff. There's a book about these kind of early modern women rulers, which gets into that a little bit. And it's something that I don't know as much about, is like just the strategies that they employed. But it is a fascinating topic because you have to be. I mean, we see some of this today, right? And this is one of the ways where I think there's resonances from the Habsburgs still today, because obviously I am not a woman, but from what I observe, there's this stuff like with women leaders have this impossible task of being both soft and vulnerable, because if you're seen as too hard, then you're a nasty woman, to use the phrase of a former president whom I'm not a huge fan of. But so you have to be seen to be like soft and motherly, but you also have to be smart and on top of things. So it's a like almost impossible thing to straddle. Pam says women had more power when they gave birth to sons. Yeah, totally. I would like to have coffee with Aunt Maria, who raised Charles V and then helped rule the Netherlands. Yeah. No, I think that is a fantastic choice. If we can only choose one, and I chose Philip IV, please let me know, you who have coffee with Maria. Well, let me know what she says, right? In fantasy land, let me know what you learned from her.
She'd probably say it's a struggle, but anyway.
Yeah. Every day.
Can I just add to that? Because I mean, your book have obviously made me think about the stories about the Scandinavian kingdom. I mean, the kingdom of Denmark, where I grew up, right? It still is a kingdom, by the way, surprisingly enough. But the first really strong woman was 1300s, Margarett the First, who was actually gathering Norway, Sweden, Denmark. And there's some fascinating literature about her and how that worked out for her. So if anybody's interested.
Did she manage to stay in power? She wasn't overthrown or anything? Like, was she?
No, she was. Yeah. No, the thing is that I call her a queen, but she was never allowed to be a queen because there was no law. I mean, the first real queen of Denmark, sole ruler, was 1957, I think it was the actual queen of Denmark. There was a new law that had to be made because there were only girls. So Margarett the First had to officially let her son, who was like 10 years old, be the king. But she was such an amazing woman. I mean, there are so fascinating stories about her. Anyway, that was my geeking out.
No, super cool. Yeah, no, that is such a worthy topic, is women rulers from the past and how they managed to do it and be successful. Is unimaginable, given the odds that they were working against. Other thoughts on any of that kind of stuff? Let's see, yeah, that's a good question. If there's a book about Margaretta, well, I guess I would ask another one of my questions. Is if you found like a most interesting period that you would like to go back to, and Laura was talking about the period that interests her the most. This is a comment in the question spreadsheet. The period that interests her the most is the Greatest Generation. So that's like the first half of the 1500s, coming as it did during the Reformation and the radical changes that were wrought during that era. And she says, relative to the question of what seems like relevant to our current century, this era also gives Charles purchasing the title of Holy Roman Emperor and how that connects to money and politics today. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So I'm curious if anybody has thoughts on if you could have the time machine and go back to one particular period of Habsburg history, where would you go and why? Yeah, everybody must have some favorite history period. I'm betting if you're on this call, you're enough of a history nerd that you have somewhere in your head you'd love to go back to. It doesn't even have to be Habsburg period per se, but I would love to hear from anybody who, if when we get that time machine invented, you're going to go back and say, hello, Crusades, or whatever it might be. Yeah.
I would like to be in that entire Balkans region in the 12th, 13th century, when you still have the heavy influence in trading from Asia. You have what's going to become the Habsburg, the different empires. The Ottomans are about to emerge. I really would like to see the roots, which I think is really pre-modern Southeastern Europe in a lot of ways. I'd like to be there for that.
Yeah, that would be super, super interesting. And because that's a part of the world which is still so misunderstood, right? And to go back and see like what's really going on here when you have these empires starting to collide, is like the Ottomans are coming up from Anatolia and colliding with like the Serbian kingdom, and there's like a Bosnian kingdom, and then you get the Hungarian kingdom, which then gets taken over by the Habsburgs. Like all this stuff is this like great power politics like 700 some years ago would be super, super interesting. So yeah, that is a really interesting choice. If you go back there to that time, my friend, good luck staying alive. It was a little hairy down there in those years, but good luck.
Fortune favors the bold. So
there you go. Exactly. Yeah. Anybody else want to share a period you'd love to go back and visit?
Julian, I have a question.
I'd like to go back to every period, but in terms of the Habsburgs, I go back to that moment you just talked about when Charles V unites the northern and southern part of the Habsburg Empire. The early 1500s is a mind-blowing moment in history. America's been discovered. We've got all these voyages going on. The printing press has been around for half a century, so there's hundreds of printing presses around Europe and millions of volumes being printed. And then you have Martin Luther, you have Henry VIII, the foundations of modern France, all these things happening within the space of the first 2 decades of the 16th century.
Yeah, totally. And that's just like the political stuff, leaving aside some of the artistic and cultural things where Raphael is alive, right? And you're kind of in the tail end of like the high Renaissance. Yeah, there's like this.
And it's coming into France. It's the moment when the high Renaissance, the influence through the French wars in Italy, that influence comes into France.
Yeah, and I think that is I would say, from my perspective, fascinating choice, because that's a pivotal few decades in Western history, right? Like so many things happened then, and just even the Reformation, right? Like people, there's certainly in the last couple of years, because it was the 500th anniversary of like Martin Luther and the beginning of the Reformation, but that's that man changed the world, right? And all that stuff is going on, and think about it from the perspective, just to make the Habsburg connection on that, think about it as you're Charles V, where you have this ideology that you're supposed to keep Christendom together. You're supposed to keep all these people in one basket, and suddenly it's like fragmenting, and and people becoming heretics. And it's not just Catholics versus Protestants, because there's all this fragmentation within Protestants too, right? And there's liberal Catholics and conservative Catholics, and they're all kind of squabbling. So there's just this amazing transformations going on right then that, yeah, to have a ringside seat on that period would be incomparable. Laura says she seconds Julian's choice. Yeah, do you want to add to that, Laura? Like, I'm not, is anybody else hearing Laura? No, we're not hearing you. I'm still not getting you.
How's that?
Yes, there you go.
Had the wrong microphone. So I think we're still really living with some of the repercussions of that era. The religious wars that, of course, transpired from that and went on and really changed the political and economic landscape of Europe, I think, for centuries probably.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even still, and now in this country, you're talking about, what are some of the things that we see that are kind of similar, is that there are still some religious wars happening in the US right now. We're shaping them as political wars.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure whether they're political that look like religious or religious that look like political. I'm not sure, but I do think that there are some of those, like I said, echoes that we're still living with. I was particularly interested in the intersection of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and how the Holy Roman Empire, that was like, because I struggled. I knew that Charles was Catherine's nephew, but I never could figure out how come, how did that come about? So this has really helped me kind of understand that, because that period of time is like Julian said, I'm really taken with that period of time, because I do think so much change happened because as a result of it, and even to the point of getting Da Vinci into France, and how all of those, I just thought was pretty interesting. So
yeah,
it's also a period when I think we are increasing European interest in and copying of the past. Because in that same period, you've got the unearthing of the Laocoon in Rome and influencing Michelangelo. You've got this extraordinary thing in Spain where they get rid of the Muslims and then they copy their architecture, and you carry on, you get rid of the people, but keep all the art, as it were. So there's all these things going. I think it's a very interesting period.
Yeah, definitely. And just even Laura, like your point, that's one of the things that explodes right in these couple decades we're talking about, is this need to try to sort out the relationship of religion to politics in a way that it's not that it hadn't been there before, because of course the struggles between the secular power of the king and the spiritual power of the Pope have been going on for centuries, but it just becomes so much different when you've got competing versions of Christianity there. And that's, I think we are still feeling the repercussions of that in some ways.
Well, there was also the whole, people began to feel free to question authority. They questioned the authority of the church, they questioned the authority of the king, and people began to, and again, thinking of this in a religious terminology, that people felt free to go directly to God. They didn't need to go through layers of, to get to God anymore. The Protestants opened that door for them. And so then that struggle for the kings and the popes to keep control of the power, I think, is some of the things they put into place as a result that were so egregious in many ways. And again, that just caused people to rebel even more. So it became just a really interesting cycle of time. I'm really intrigued with that era. And if I could go back there, if I thought I could survive it, I would go back to that area of time.
Nice.
I'm not sure it's strong enough. Yeah.
Laura, you must have read Wolf Hall and its sequels.
Oh, yeah.
By Herman Mantel, yeah.
And again, I'm just really and discovering, this is a little side tangent, but that they just discovered, they think, the foundations of Wolf Hall, which I thought were really interesting. And I guess Mark Seymour, who's one of the guides, who is apparently some sort of a descendant of the Seymours. So anyway, you can see I could geek out on this all day long. I'll stop talking now.
No, thank you. That's awesome. That's great. Anybody else on that historical period? You get a time machine. Where are you going? Really? Oh man, that's my dream, right? Trish.
No, I was just going to say
Oh.
that everybody's being so shy, and I am so magnetically drawn to what Laura was saying, because I think that essential question of how do those things intertwine is not, it's never just politics, it's never just religion, it's never just power, it's never just money, it's all of those things. And it is, I think, impossible to unwind all of that and say that this is the main factor, or this is that, because it's so well integrated. And when you have that kind of when you have such a stronghold on any one of those things, to see that start to dissipate or to fragment or whatever, I mean, it just makes everybody kind of want to hunker down and cling on to it even more. But a further point that Laura was talking about, because it allowed people to then ask those questions, to freely ask those questions, to start saying, wait, hang on a second, I don't need to be doing this, or I don't need you to be doing this. It is not only a change for that time period, but again, as you said, Laura, moving forward into what we do now, we don't have this possibility of creative thinking, of technological development, of political forward movement without all of the stuff that happened beforehand, right? I mean, if we had just all stayed sheep and been like, yes, very good. I mean, you just don't have that kind of development. So if not for all of those things, we literally are not where we are and who we are today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't know how much of I don't know, having to like discuss with a bunch of strangers is holding people back, but let me throw this question out there and see if it goes anywhere. And that is, it's a really broad one. Like, what, if any, takeaways do you have from Habsburg history and from, learning about the way this dynasty ruled and kind of the way it rode some of these waves of historical change? And I really want to hear from everybody. I'll just tell you one thing just to seed it, to see if this gets us anywhere. Is thinking about like, what's the relevance of stuff today? And one of the things that I find fascinating about the Habsburgs is that they point back to a time before national states, right? To the idea when it didn't matter in 1500 if your ruler didn't speak your language, or didn't matter very much, right? If you live in, I don't know what, Bohemia, where I am in Prague, some of the Habsburgs spoke Czech, some of them didn't. But to most people, the guy who rules me is actually German, and they didn't care, right? But then by the time you get to 400 years in the future and the end of the 1800s, and damn it, you better have a ruler who speaks your language, right? Because you're supposed to be ruled by someone who's of the same nationality or ethnicity that you are. But even though I am no monarchist by any means, and not in general a fan of kind of aristocratic ideas of status and all the divine right nonsense, to me, that's something I admire about the Habsburgs, is that they do represent historically this kind of supranational governance of a time before, like, okay, well, we gotta, all the Portuguese people have to be ruled by someone who's Portuguese, right? All the Dutch people have to be ruled by someone who's Dutch, or have to be in a state, a polity with someone who's Dutch. Can't we like look beyond our national differences and try to like work together and be part of some political system that's even bigger, and that gets beyond national boundaries? And that's, the European Union has some trappings of that, but it's fascinating that maybe, I mean, this is a huge question for the future, but depending on what happens to the European Union in the future, that maybe it is, as people make the analogy sometimes, maybe it's almost like the time of, or a reminder of the time of dynastic states, where you could have a bunch of different nations ruled by some power that's overarches them all and brings them all together into one polity, as the Habsburgs did with their realms, all these different peoples speaking different languages, and there's these Habsburgs at the top of it, and they kind of brought them all in, and it worked for centuries. So that's, I'm in some ways admire that was a model that worked for centuries, this supranational thing, rather than the, I don't know what, smaller kind of national states or national idea that is so dominant since the 1800s. I don't know if that might be too heavy and too big, but I'm curious if anybody else has reactions to that or other kind of thoughts on takeaways, stuff that you learned.
Ben, if I may, so in you bringing that up, I do find that interesting, and they're certainly not the first to do that. If we think about the Roman Empire and we think about how when they did conquer other lands, other groups, their intent was to absorb them into the empire, right? Like as long as you follow our rules and you say that the emperor is the guy and essentially he's your god, then good. And we'll take all of your religions and we'll take all of your superstitions and we'll take all of these things. And of course, we'll take your money. So be part of the team and we're all together. But do those two examples then necessitate having a structural leadership to have that kind of governance and having everybody buy into it? Because the optimist in me would just say, can't we all just get along? Can't we just all see that there is the united humanity that we share, that we have the one planet, we're all in this together, so can we just figure that out? And maybe that is too optimistic and I don't know, and naive, but does there need to be somebody saying, okay, we're going to impose this, and this is how it's going to be controlled and how it's going to be monitored. It's all for everybody's good, you know? I mean, that just, to me, that sounds too, I don't know, too Big Brother, I guess.
Yeah, what about, is it possible that would it be disturbing if it were democratically chosen? Okay.
It would be disturbing to me, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it would be disturbing to me because there still would be something that is trying to impose that everything. And I live in I am the kind of person who grew up watching the reruns of Star Trek, you know, the original series, and then very, very, very much love Star Trek: The Next Generation. And so that whole idea of a federation and all the worlds are connected and we all have this, you know, there might be tensions and we still have issues, but that notion of having that happen is a beautiful idea to me. And yet you can still see the realities with another group, right? The Romulans, whoever your enemy might be, and saying, no, we don't want this empire telling us what to do. You don't have the right to say that.
I love that your brain went to Star Trek because that mine went there too. Or Klingons. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anybody, please.
Yeah. In reading about the end, the coming of World War I, and then what happened immediately afterwards and leading to the Holocaust, I can't remember what author I read, but stating that that the Jewish peoples within Europe were much better off during the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they would have been better protected. And maybe that would have, and there were a lot of different reasons, but the idea that this idea of nationality, the way we understand it, didn't exist at this point, divided by religion, and since you had these large Jewish families, the Rothschilds, who had connections all over the place, and there was a financial dependence based on essentially, in great part, to some racism and anti-Semitism within the context of pre-20th century Europe, but that the monarchy and monarchies would have prevented the Holocaust from taking place. Now, given there's ideas of democracy and things like that that evolved after World War II in particular, but I found that a very valid argument for the monarch in defense of monarchy.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, because that is something that the Habsburgs did to a certain extent at certain times, and not always, but is protect the minorities, right? Especially like little peoples, like the fact that the Slovenians, there's 2 million of them today, and there didn't used to be that many of them in history, but they kind of they had a place. They weren't ever exterminated by the Italians or the Germans around them because they kind of had a little place in the Habsburg Empire. Like the Habsburgs made a place for them, and it's complicated, but I think there's something to that.
I mean, people would say the same thing, kind of contemporary to Saddam Hussein, in that having that strong arm leader there was a sense of stability. Now, not everybody was treated fairly, obviously, but there was a stability that is lacking now because of him being deposed in the way that he was deposed. So I don't know. Those are interesting points. I'm glad you brought that up, Jaime.
Yeah. Even with Nina, please.
No, it's just that made me think of former Yugoslavia. You know, when I traveled in, let's say, the early 70s, and then coming back, and there was still the image of Tito, right? And because there was a nostalgia, and that is interesting. That's the other thing that I made, your book made me think about, is nostalgia about former empires, former, fame and fortune and all that still pops up, I mean, in France, we have 3 different branches. Julian, you can maybe pop in there also. We have what? Napoleon's heirs, we have the House of Bourbon, and we have House of Orleans. Still talking about bringing back monarchy in France. You're going, are you crazy? But it's still there. And there are people who actually, are behind them. They're not all alone in France, right? It's an interesting thing about nostalgia, about, this former greatness of an empire, right?
Yeah, and thinking like, what can the people in France who are like the monarchists, what do they think the Bourbons are going to do for them? They're going to do for France, right? And that actually I would love to hear from Jorge and Fran, like, so Spain is still a monarchy, right? I mean, and it's also, there's an argument, you could say that like the monarchy in Spain helps create this umbrella over the Catalans, the Castilians, the Galicians, the Basques, the Andalusians. I mean, what do you guys think of like the purpose or function or value of the Spanish monarchy is?
And now war starts.
Oh, really? Now it gets ugly. Okay.
Because I know Jorge's opinion about it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Okay. So my opinion is that I personally like the monarchy, the Spanish monarchy. Okay. I think they are over a bunch of trashy politicians that we have. And they cost money. Yeah. To me, I have too many cousins, brothers-in-law being paid. All of those I can get rid of. But the image of the king, the queen, and the future queen, I accept it. And I think they are the ones that I think they're not well used. They are the politicians that we have. I think they're so bad that they don't know how to use the monarchy. The monarchy has a very good reputation. Like the Brits, for example, they do it much better. In the moment there's a problem, there goes Kate Middleton. Hi. Perfect family picture. The whole world is happy. You don't see our queen. Well, you don't see our queen because she's way too thin and she's like half a person. But besides that, we don't use them. We don't publicly use them, and we should. So I think they have a value. We have all of this history behind them that a lot of countries like the United States, Canada, value a lot. That heritage of the crown, it's like, whoa, the Brits, the crown, the Elizabeth, all of this. It's like this, I wouldn't say an obsession, but the #1 TV series now, it's The Crown. Why? Because everybody looks at them. Does anybody know our queen? Nobody. Why are we not using them? Why are we not selling them everywhere around the world? And okay, you cute princess, show up, and here and here and here and here. My kids, they are super obsessed because our royal family, they say they don't post anything on Instagram. They don't do anything. While you go to Kate Middleton, you go to the Royal British, all of them, they're doing a lot of things, and you see what they're doing. Ours, nothing. And they do a lot. Okay, Jorge, kill me now. You may.
Off with his head.
No, I'm not gonna kill your friend. Don't worry about that. Look, I do. I respect the monarchy because it's the heritage of a country. I respect that, and I have to respect it because it's in the Constitution, and it says that is the head of state. doesn't make any influence at all in the government decisions. That's what the Constitution says. So I just call the royal house here like a very expensive public relationships people, right? Okay, and now answering a little bit of what Fran said, I totally agree that our politicians nowadays, and at least I'm talking about Spain, okay? Nobody else, it's just Spain. They are trash, seriously. They I mean, they don't know how to behave themselves. How can they tell the monarch what to do? Because they are in power to tell the monarch what to do. If they have some agreements in the government house, they take the rules to the monarch, and because the Constitution says that he has to sign them, he has to sign them. But I totally agree that we are underusing them. They should do something more to get closer to the people. I mean, for that, the good example is the British royal family. They really know how to do things. I mean, and also it goes on the character. Don't forget that we are talking about Mediterranean countries. We are more open, more outdoors people. At the same time, we are also a little bit introvert, but the character of the Mediterranean cannot be compared at all with the Central European character, and cannot be compared at all with the British Isles. Character. It's a compendium of several things. So do I agree with them? Having them, I better say, I have my points, but I respect them because they are there. And thanks to the father of the actual monarch, and Frank, I suppose that you agree with me, he saved the country in 1981 of a coup d'etat, okay? And that was a very good act he did. But then his late times as a monarch, he made so many mistakes. You know, he's just so childish that literally left the crown to a kid, Philip VI, right now, that I think that took everybody, including the king himself, by surprise. So yes, I agree in a lot of things what you said, Fran. So I'm not kidding you, right?
I saw some. We don't have that much time left, but I saw Julian get indignant. I would love to see if you what do you have to say.
No, it was simply, Jorge, when you said the British royal family know how to do things, I thought, yes, at the moment we've got one who's being accused of paedophilia, one who's being kicked out and gone to Los Angeles. So they do know how to do things, but it has been decades and decades of scandal upon scandal. So the greatest soap opera on earth. And going back to Laura's remarks about religion and Trish talking about intertwining, the Queen is also the head of the Church of England. So there are four of us, at least four of us on this Zoom, who come from countries that have monarchies still. And in fact, a whole bunch of countries in Western Europe are still monarchies, but they're all very, very different styles. But the United Kingdom, we actually have a head of state, a non-elected head of state, who's also, so we have an established church, that makes it even more complicated. And Fran, you mentioned Canada. The Queen is head of state of Canada, head of state of Australia, New Zealand as well, I forget. So this is the extraordinary thing. This woman who's there through an accident of her uncle, let's say.
Isn't it the whole Commonwealth, Julian?
She's not head of state of the Commonwealth countries. Yeah. That's different. She's not heads of state of those countries. It's much more the Commonwealth is incomprehensible to everybody. But I missed out somewhere. There's Canada, Australia. Does anyone know the other place where she's head of state? Anyway.
Yeah, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, I think, are the ones, aren't they?
That's enough. And she, of course, going back to what you said, Ben, the British royal family changed their name, I think, before the end of World War I, from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor, because of anti-German feeling. And when we were talking about keeping it in the family, I was trying to work out in my head how much British blood Queen Elizabeth has. And it's not that much. And her children, of course, are half Greek. Half their blood is Greek, or not even Greek, because he was so of mixed parentage. So this intermarrying has gone all over the place. We had generations of haemophiliacs because of inbreeding in the British royal family. I am, for those of you who don't know me, I'm remaining very, very civil. I won't go further about talking about the British royal family, but I'll let you read between the lines about where I stand on the ins and outs of them. I will say it's of great entertainment value. I think the Spanish royal family, Fran, I wrote in the chat, the image of the king in the last couple of years has not been perhaps the image the country wants or needs. And no one knows in the UK what's going to happen when the Queen dies, which is going to be in the not too distant future. It's not clear what form the monarchy will take after she's gone. And I will stop there before I say things that will have you stoning me.
Yeah, no, that's this. We maybe need to find a way to discuss this in the future on Guide Collected or something like that. I mean, the one thing I would say, just to wrap stuff up from my end of things, is the Habsburgs to me are a fascinating example of how bad an idea dynasties are in some ways, right? Even though I said, I was sort of alluding to, I think there's some utility to them in creating the supranational kind of rule, which to me is, I prefer over this national states thing where it makes you small rather than think big and think of, you know, what all we have in common rather than what's different. But so, you know, they serve a purpose for that, but also dynasties, man, right? Where you get people who are desperately incapable of being in charge of things, like Charles II in Spain, to go back to that example, but there's various other ones in Habsburg history who, like, that person shouldn't be within 100 meters of any kind of power, right? Like, keep that person well away. And there's even, I mean, we don't have to go down this road either, again, for time, but it's interesting to think about how this relates to today, because not just in the country I come from, the US, but in other countries, there are still dynasties, there are still political dynasties. And there, I mean, in the US, there's more than one family that wants a political dynasty right now, where, you know, oh yeah, that person should be in charge because his or her father or mother maybe was in charge. And it's like, ew, really? Is that qualification? That sounds like a good idea to you, right? So even though the Habsburgs as a dynasty now don't have political power, that's one of the things which is worth thinking about, I think, going forward is, what did we learn as a species from having dynasties in charge of things? Was that really the way to go? And yet, even in democracies, you get the dynasties start to form. So that's an interesting question of what is that in us that seems to sometimes swerve towards this power of dynasties. I don't know. Brilliant. Well, yeah, Jorge.
Yeah, Ben, you have mentioned 3 or 4 times Charles II, you know, the last Habsburg here in Spain, and you also mentioned that his father was his aunt, you know, and was an aunt and a niece, you know, married together with the benediction of the Pope at the time, etc., etc. We all know, I mean, you and probably most of you that you read the book, that he was nicknamed as the Bewitched. So, and you also have mentioned, because of the so much inbreeding among the royal houses. Do you mind if I share a portrait I have here about him, just to see how he looked like?
Yeah, sure.
There you go.
There he was, yes. And that's better than he looked in real life, right? Like,
to be honest, I don't know.
No, I'm sure that's true, because these royal portraitists had to make them look reasonably good, right?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things of the, especially, you know, the core painters at the time, and you know, Charles I or Charles V, who is the same person, held 2 titles, you know, Charles V of Germany and Charles I of Spain. You mentioned the other day about his lower jaw, how prominent it was, and one of his favorite portraits was the one that is here in the private museum in Madrid, that actually doesn't show the jaw that prominent outside, and that was his favorite portrait, you know. And yeah, probably this one is also much better of what he looked in real life.
Yeah. And Pam mentioned that no one wants to let go of power, be it monarchy or democratic government leaders. Yeah, I think you've hit on something there, Pam, that partly what explains these dynasties is people, once they get power, they want to hold on to power because power gives them jollies, I guess. Well, I think I will wrap things up, right? We've been going a little bit about an hour, and I don't want to take everyone's mornings or evenings, wherever it might be. So, thank you. I think Julian gave me an applaud thing, but I want to applaud everybody for hanging in there. If you read the book, thank you. I mean, I know it's, like I said, the very first session, it's dense, right? It's an academic book. It's not too fluffy. So if you made it through it, thank you. I really hope you learned something. I would love to, if you have any thoughts or want to discuss it or anything like that, you can find me on Guide Collective or find me on oh, nice. Thank you. College Library. I appreciate it. But I just appreciate the chance to get to talk about these things, and for your attention and interest. That means so much to me. Thanks also to Trish for steering this. She is, yeah, absolutely. Everybody applaud Trish, because this would not happen without her. And thanks everybody for being here tonight. The one last thing I will say, this is where I make a cheeky request, cheeky in the British sense. If you read the book, if you bought the book on Amazon, and if you thought the book might be worthy of a 5-star review, that really helps me out. Because sometimes, I don't know if you've ever noticed this on Amazon, but with a couple of my books, you get crank reviews occasionally, where someone says, 1 star, I didn't like the font. And so if you happen to read the book or buy the book on Amazon and like it and think it's worthy of a 5-star review, I would certainly appreciate it if you would go and give it a thumbs up, because it helps other people find the book who might learn something from it. So that's me. That's my one cheeky request. But I'm going to namaste everyone. Thank you so much for being here and your interest and your support. And it's really been a joy for me. And I'll hand it over to Trish because the next book club is coming up next month, and that's going to be good too.
So yeah, we've got a little bit of housekeeping to do, but I'm sure that as I say this, everybody's feeling the same thing. Ben, you did an outstanding job, not just today, not just on the first day when you did the introduction, but everything that you submitted throughout the entire month just really broadened our understanding, not only of the book, but of the family itself, and diving deeper into history and finding those connections, because I think we as travelers, we do want to engage, right? We do want to learn more. And the more we learn about this thing, it allows us to spark that interest to learn even more. And now I know that when all of us go back to Europe, or those of you who are already there, when you go to explore other parts of Europe, we're going to be looking at things with different eyes. And that's due to you and what you've shared with us, Ben. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. I will say there was a comment, I'm not even sure from who, let me go back just a little bit, from who said something about wanting to listen to more from Julian. Somebody said that.
Oh, Laura said
Laura,
that. Yes,
Laura.
Laura.
And I would agree. And so, Julian, I'm going to go ahead and make a public request. This was not on my list of things to do, but I'm going to go ahead and make a public request that if you wanted to take a topic, don't hide. Don't you hide from me. I know where to find you. I know where your house is. If you want to do something maybe about the monarchy and do something for Guide Collective Book Club, or if you want to do any kind of presentation, we'd all eat that up handily. But just so that you know, Julian does do a lot of presentations. He does do a lot of virtual events and does a lot of great teaching, which is not necessarily always publicized on Guide Collective. But if you do want to reach out to him one-on-one, I'm going to say, go ahead and email him. So there you go, Julian. He's going to say, no, don't do it.
No, can I just make a comment? I thought that this general discussion, when we open up and talk about things related to, but not necessarily about the book, and we did the same when Nina did the Mas Español books, I think it's very interesting. And maybe that's something we could think about doing, having general discussions, follow-up discussions if people are interested, where it's just an exchange of ideas as an extension to the month's book at a later, less formally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like that idea a lot, and I'm sure that we would get a lot of participation. So that's something that we can talk about that at our general meeting, and you and I can talk about that one-on-one. But I really like the direction you're thinking about that. Okay, so that's the one thing. The next thing is, as a thank you to Ben, as he mentioned, if you want to do any of those 5-star reviews on Amazon, that would be great. If you want to send him a private message via email, you can do that as well at Benjamin W. Curtis@yahoo.com, and he would love to get that feedback directly from you and interact with you if you have specific questions. And then if you want to show an expression of financial gratitude to him, because this again is all done on a voluntary basis. He's put all these great presentations together, and that is true of all of our Guide Collective members. He has a virtual tip jar at paypal.me/bcurtis90. And that is on our website. So if you didn't write that down, or if I went too fast, you can check that out. I also want to say too, that if you want to dive deeper into what he has been talking about regarding the Habsburgs, he also helps to co-host a podcast called Eastern Approaches. And he does that with our colleague, Andrew Vallone. And although the title is Eastern Approaches, they generally focus on Central and Eastern Europe. And they have a number of episodes that do dive into cultural and historical past as it relates to the Habsburgs. So you can check that out. It is on our website if you go to GC Radio, but it's also on any podcast platform. So wherever you find your podcasts, you can find them, Eastern Approaches podcasts. And then I would like to go a little bit into next month. So we have our moderator for next month with us. And you probably already saw the posts, but Jorge Roman is going to be leading the moderation for Paulo Coelho's book, The Pilgrimage. It was his first book. And so I'll turn the reins over to Jorge to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Trish. Actually, I have it here just by coincidence, So here it is. It's, that Paulo Coelho, he got fame just by The Alchemist. That it was like 2 years after he wrote this book. And as he says in the webpage, in the Guide Collective webpage, he had a very inspirational journey in the Camino de Santiago. And that's what he got inspired to write his very first novel, which is this one over here. And wasn't very successful until he reached fame, late on his life, mid-40s. And I have to tell you, I read the book many years ago, I can't remember how long ago, but because of my job, being on the road for the last 25 years, I have made bits and pieces of the Camino regarding the tour where I was taking. I haven't done the whole Camino. I do have my credential. I do have some stamps on it. And, the last time I decided to read the whole book again was when I started with, Rick Steves just doing the Basque Country tour, which we do a little bit of a track over there of the Camino de Santiago. And I have to say, I'm not a religious person. I'm more a spiritual person. And all I want to say as an advance for this, because I need to say some speeches for the presentation of the book. The thing that got me inspired years ago when I read the book the first time, and you're going to laugh, is when Shirley MacLaine did the Camino herself in the 90s, because I love her as an actress. And then suddenly, I remember myself looking in the news that she was like, yelling to the newspaper, to the news reporters following her, trying to take snap photos, just leave me alone or something like that. And that's what got me into her biography and then reading the book. How weird is that? And there are more weird things, spiritually or cosmic things that has happened to me related to the book and my personal life that I will share with you next week. Is that next week, Trish? Yes, on Monday, right?
Already next week, if you can believe that. So next Monday, as you all know, Mondays are basically our GCBC days. So next Monday will be the introduction. That will be on Facebook. So there is no Zoom link required for that. You just tune into Facebook if you want to watch it live. Otherwise, you can watch the recording. And then at the end of the month, the final Monday will be like this, the group discussion. But I also did want to bring into this conversation Fran Glaria, because he is going to be doing some supplemental content. And I'm really excited about that because I've gone through and edited a couple of the articles and those are ready to be put out there, but he has other events as well. So Fran, can you tell us a little bit about that?
So when the book, The Pilgrimage, was chosen, I was super happy because I live in the Camino. I live in Pamplona, and every day when I come out of my doorstep, I'm on the Camino. It walks through my home. So one of the ideas that we got is like, why don't we all walk one day in the Camino? So on the second Monday, which is Monday the 10th, I will go all the way up to a mountain and we'll go walking down the Camino all together. I'll go with the camera. Hopefully I will not trip. You just see a camera rolling down. And I will try to explain you part of the spirituality of the Camino, part of that immenseness of the Camino. It's not just going to be religion, it's more spiritual. And one of the things that pilgrims, when they walk the Camino, when they have a personal memory of somebody that they love, maybe they have gone, or they need, somebody that you suddenly, somebody touches you and you don't know why this person comes to you. In the Camino, the pilgrims leave a little stone in the Camino. So I thought that it could be a great idea. If by any chance, when you start reading from here until the 10th, if somebody crosses your heart, crosses your soul, that you were not expecting, send us the name of this person. I will write it for you on a stone, and I'll leave the stone for your friend in the Camino. So I would love to do that. And if anybody comes through, just let me know and I'll write the names for you and leave them in the Camino. That will be on the 10th. And 1 week later, I will do a presentation of the history of St. James to know who on earth was this gentleman, and how he ended up in Spain and why the Camino started. So those are two of the events that we have ready for this month. So can't wait to start reading the book.
And there's actually even more than that. I want to say how grateful I am to every guide who has participated in this Guide Collective book club, because they keep generating these really amazing ideas. This is the only book club that I know of, anyways, that does all of this supplemental content. I mean, as far as I've ever experienced a book club, it's, okay, here's the book, we'll gather in a month and talk about it. And really, it's just an excuse to drink wine and eat snacks, But there's so much, me personally, that I'm learning, and that's because my colleagues are fantastic. Fantastic in this case, but everybody's fantastic. So huge thanks to all of you guys. If you guys have questions, you can email me at theguidecollective@gmail.com. If you have other friends or family members who would like to join, please encourage them to do so. And you know how easy it is to sign up. And I think that is it for today. So I wish you all very well and happy reading, and we will see you all next week.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Adios, chicos. Bye-bye.
Adios.
Adios.